My name is Valeria Montiel and, for many years, I was a Mormon. I grew up in the church believing I was on the only true path, following its rules without question. But behind the perfect image they sold, there was something much darker. The truth inside the church was far worse than anyone could imagine. Secrets were hidden, women were silenced, and fear kept everyone trapped in an unquestionable system. It took me a long time to see it, but when I finally saw the reality, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Today, I'm here to tell what no one dares to say. I was born and raised in a world where everything had already been determined for me before I could even understand the meaning of the word choice. My family was part of a church that called itself the only true one, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, better known as the Mormon Church, a sacred refuge for those chosen by God. From a very young age, I was told that all other religions were wrong, that those who followed different doctrines were condemned, and that doubting was the first step toward damnation. The faith I was raised in wasn't just a belief, but an unbreakable structure that ruled every aspect of my life. There was no room for questioning, for doubts, or for any thoughts that might suggest there was another truth beyond what we were taught. The church leaders weren't just pastors or spiritual guides. They were untouchable, almost divine figures, whose word was considered the voice of God on earth. Disobeying them was the same as disobeying the Lord Himself. My childhood was surrounded by strict rules. We weren't allowed to watch television because it was said to be a corrupting influence from the outside world. We couldn't listen to music that wasn't sacred hymns from the church. Reading any book that wasn't the Bible or church-approved publications was discouraged. At school, I wasn't allowed to be friends with classmates who weren't part of the church. Forming relationships with outsiders meant opening the door to sin, and sin was seen as something that contaminated, something that would pull us away from the kingdom of heaven. I got used to living in a closed-off world, where every step needed approval. My clothes were simple and modest, always covering as much of my body as possible. My hair had to be long, natural, and well-kept, because cutting it was a sign of rebellion. The girls in the church were taught from a very young age that they had to be pure, submissive, and modest. Our mission was to please God and be worthy of the husband He would choose for us. In my house, my father was the absolute authority. As a man, he was the one who decided everything, and no one could question him. My mother, although a strong and resilient woman, was molded to believe her role was to obey and serve, just like all the other women in the congregation. I saw sadness in her eyes that I didn't understand at the time. Now I know that she, like me, also grew up inside that bubble and never had a choice. The church occupied every minute of our lives. Daily services, prayer meetings, scripture study groups, spiritual retreats. Everything was scheduled so that there was no time to look outside. The outside world was described as a place of damnation, where people lived in the darkness of sin. It was a constant fear. The fear of falling, of making a mistake, of disappointing, of not being worthy enough to reach heaven. I remember once, when I was still very young, I heard a neighbor talk about God in a way I had never heard before. She said that God was love, that He embraced all people no matter where they came from or what they believed. That confused me. After all, I had always been taught that only we, inside our church, were accepted by Him. Innocently, I asked my mother about it. I'll never forget the look on her face in that moment. She turned serious, her eyes reflecting genuine fear. She made me sit down and explained firmly. "We can't listen to those things, sweetheart. Those are words meant to confuse us. The enemy uses those people to plant doubts in our hearts. And once you start doubting, he already has a place inside you." That conversation marked me deeply. That's when I understood the weight of the guilt we carried. If I ever felt doubt, it meant something was wrong inside me. The problem was never in the doctrine or teachings, but always in my faith, which had to be unshakable. Little by little, I started learning that suppressing questions was a sign of obedience and loyalty. Doubt was a weakness, a deviation that could pull me away from divine grace. So whenever my mind started to raise questions, I would do my best to silence them, like a fire that couldn't be allowed to grow. Girls in the church were trained to be perfect wives from childhood. We were told from a young age that our destiny was marriage, and our greatest achievement would be to build a godly family. Women had no voice, no leadership, no power to choose. Their only role was to serve, stay silent, and accept. I wanted to be good. I wanted to please God. I wanted to be an obedient daughter. I wanted to fulfill my role the right way. But in the middle of all that, there was a restlessness inside me. Something that, no matter how hard I tried to ignore, was silently growing in my heart. The church leaders said we were the chosen ones, that we were the only ones who were right, that we had to separate ourselves from the world to maintain our holiness. But if that was true, why did I always feel a tightness in my chest whenever I looked at the world outside? Why, even when I did everything right, did I still feel like something was missing? That was a question I couldn't ask out loud. After all, doubting was the first step toward damnation. And I was still just a girl learning how to silence my own voice. From a very young age, I knew that being a woman in the church meant being less. Not because anyone said it outright, but because it was between the lines of every teaching, every rule, every disapproving look. Men had all the power. They could speak, they could lead, they could decide what was right and what was wrong. We women had to obey and smile. Silence was taught to us from childhood. Talking too much was a sin. Having our own opinions was dangerous. A woman's fate was already determined before she could choose anything. We grew up hearing that women were created to be companions, submissive and obedient, and that anything outside of that was rebellion against God. The first time I truly felt diminished for being a woman was when I was still very young. During a Sunday school class, a girl asked the teacher a question about a Bible verse that talked about the role of women. She wanted to understand why God had placed men as leaders and women as helpers. The teacher sighed, gave her an impatient look, and replied coldly, "Because that's the natural order of things. God made man in his image, and woman was made to assist him. If a woman rebels against that order, she is rebelling against God." I never forgot that moment. That girl fell silent, her eyes downcast, as if her simple question had been an unforgivable mistake. And I understood. We weren't allowed to question. Girls were taught to be ashamed of their bodies from a young age. Everything about us seemed to be seen as a problem, something to be controlled, repressed. Dress decently. Don't be provocative. You need to be a woman of God. These phrases were repeated like a mantra, always reminding us that we were responsible for the desires of men. If a man made a mistake, it was the woman's fault. If a girl was harassed, they said it was because her clothes were inappropriate. If a married man cheated on his wife, they said the mistress was a temptation sent by the devil. The woman was always the source of sin, the cause of the fall, the root of all evil. I remember a friend who was called in for a talk with the leader's wife. She had started to take interest in a boy from the church, and even though there was nothing between them but glances and shy smiles, the congregation's leader found it necessary to intervene. A woman of God cannot leave room for sin, my dear. If a man desires you, it's because you allowed it. If one day he makes a mistake, God will hold you accountable as well. My friend cried a lot after that. She started wearing even looser clothing, avoided smiling at any man, walked with her head down, always watching every gesture to avoid misinterpretation. Since adolescence, the girls in the church were prepared for marriage and motherhood. That was the only mission we were allowed to have. While the boys could dream of being bishops, missionaries, businessmen, lawyers, doctors, we could only be good wives and devoted mothers. In women-only meetings, we were taught that a true wife doesn't question, doesn't argue, doesn't raise her voice. They said God gave us the gift of submission, and that our greatest duty was to serve our husbands. The man is the head of the household. The woman must mold herself to him, not the other way around. If a young woman said she wanted to study or pursue a career, she was quickly reprimanded. God made you a woman, not a man. Your place is in the home, taking care of your family. Those who insisted on their dreams were viewed with suspicion, as if their hearts were hardened, ambitious, corrupted by worldly values. In church, men spoke. They preached, taught, gave counsel, made decisions. Women listened. Even when a woman had something important to say, she needed permission to be heard. Once, a very wise and respected older woman tried to give her opinion on a church matter. She stood up, asked to speak, and began to talk. She didn't even make it halfway through her sentence before being interrupted by one of the leaders. "Sister, remember what is written. The woman must listen in silence. That is God's teaching." She fell silent immediately and never tried to speak again. That moment stayed with me as yet another reminder that it didn't matter how much experience, intelligence, or good intentions we had. If we were women, we had no right to speak. What was most frightening was that all of this was seen as normal. There was no outrage, no resistance. From childhood, we were taught that this was the only right path, and any attempt at questioning meant rebellion against God. Even women who suffered weren't allowed to complain. An unhappy wife was advised to pray more, to try harder, to submit more. If her husband was violent or unfaithful, they told her she should get on her knees and ask God to change him. I grew up hearing that. I learned to smile even when I felt suffocated. I learned to obey even when I didn't agree. I learned to hide my voice because speaking was dangerous. And for a long time, I believed that's how it was supposed to be. Inside the church, everything revolved around fear and guilt. Fear of making mistakes, fear of questioning, fear of not being good enough, fear of disappointing God, fear of not being accepted into the kingdom of heaven. Guilt was the constant shadow that followed every thought, every action, every doubt that came into my mind. Since I was a child, I was taught that the human heart is deceitful and corrupt, that my own thoughts could be instruments of Satan to lead me away from God. If I ever asked myself whether I truly believed all of it, if I questioned the authority of the leaders, or even if I just tried to understand the teachings more deeply, that alone was a sign of spiritual weakness. The devil plants doubt in people's minds to lead them away from the truth. When doubt arises, pray and ask for forgiveness, because that's the enemy's voice trying to mislead you. That was repeated to me so many times that it became part of my identity. I learned to be afraid of my own thoughts. If I had doubts, it meant Satan was trying to mislead me. He was cunning, sneaky, infiltrating the hearts of the weakest. If someone started to question any teaching, the leaders would immediately warn. The enemy is trying to deceive you. You're leaving openings for sin. Guard your mind because that's where he works. So I tried to push away any questioning thoughts. I suppressed everything inside me, afraid that God was watching and disapproving. Once, during a service, one of the leaders spoke about the dangers of doubt. There is no middle ground. Either you serve God or you're serving the devil. Anyone who questions the faith is already stepping into the enemy's territory. I was only 12, but those words hit me hard. What if, without meaning to, I thought something wrong? What if my heart started to harden? What if, without realizing it, I was drifting away from God? That doubt terrified me. I spent sleepless nights crying, asking God to purify my mind and take any bad thoughts away from me. I wanted to be a faithful servant. I wanted to please the Lord. I wanted to be worthy of the kingdom of heaven. But deep down, there was something inside me that never fully went silent. If I wanted to leave the church, it meant I was being influenced by the sinful world. The outside world was described as a dangerous place, full of damnation, filled with corrupted people, far from God. Whoever turns away from the house of the Lord is turning their back on salvation. Outside of here, there is only pain, sadness, and emptiness. That's what we were told. And I believed it. Many times, I saw young people who decided to leave the church be treated like traitors. They were ignored, avoided, as if they carried something contagious. People spoke of them as if they were already condemned to hell. What happened to so-and-so? She left the church. She's in the world now. That last sentence carried a heavy weight. Being in the world meant being lost, without God, given over to sin. There was a girl named Rebecca who grew up with me in the church. She was always very smart and inquisitive. She didn't accept things easily and, as she got older, started to notice contradictions in the teachings. She tried to talk to the leaders, asked tough questions, challenged what was imposed on us. One day she decided to leave. What happened afterward was frightening. The leaders condemned her publicly, saying she had been overtaken by the spirit of rebellion, that she had sold her soul to the enemy. Her family, extremely devout, cut all ties with her. A month later, a woman stepped up to the pulpit to say she had a vision of Rebecca burning in hell. She said God had shown her Rebecca's future: despair, suffering, darkness. The message was clear to all of us. Anyone who left the church would be condemned. I didn't want to be like Rebecca. I didn't want to be rejected, cursed, seen as a lost sinner. So I stayed. But the fear never left me. If I thought differently from the leaders, it meant my heart had been hardened by the devil. The teachings were absolute. There was no room for interpretation or debate. The leaders spoke in God's name, and we only listened and obeyed. If anyone disagreed, the answer was always the same: "Are you questioning the word of the Lord?" And that ended any discussion. I learned not to trust what I felt. If something seemed unfair, if a rule seemed exaggerated, the problem was in me, not in the doctrine. Guilt consumed me. Once, I saw a leader tell a woman that she had to accept an arranged marriage because God had revealed that the man was the right one for her. She cried, said she didn't want it, but no one cared. The order had come from above, and questioning it would be a lack of faith. That enraged me. But I couldn't show it. If I felt something was wrong, that meant the fault was mine. Women who tried to question anything were labeled as rebellious, sinful, and unworthy of the kingdom of God. If a woman raised her voice to challenge something, they would immediately say she was being influenced by a Jezebel spirit. That was the term used to classify stubborn, disobedient, feminist women who didn't accept submission. Women who do not submit to what God has determined are dangerous. We heard that so many times that we started to believe it. I saw intelligent women who could have had great opportunities, being suffocated inside the church. If they tried to express themselves, they were quickly put back in their place. The Lord created women to serve, not to lead. And so, an entire generation of silent, submissive, and fearful women was formed. What scares me the most looking back is realizing how invisible the prison was. There were no chains on our wrists, no bars keeping us inside the church. But we were chained by fear, by guilt, by the belief that leaving meant losing everything. The control over the mind was so strong that, even when I started to see the flaws, I couldn't set myself free. Because deep down I was still afraid. Afraid of making a mistake. Afraid of questioning. Afraid of getting lost. And that was the worst punishment of all. There was a ritual in the church that all young girls feared: the confession with the leaders. Officially, it was called a spiritual interview, a moment when members were supposed to sit down with the bishops or pastors and open their hearts to seek purification and spiritual guidance. But for us women, that moment meant fear, humiliation, and trauma. From a young age, we were taught that our purity was the most important thing we had. At any sign of impurity, whether a thought, a look, or a desire, we had to confess. Otherwise, we were hiding sin and staining our souls. I clearly remember the day I was called for my first confession. I was only 14. My name was announced during the service, and at the end of the ceremony, an older woman pulled me aside and said, "The bishop wants to speak with you. It's time for your spiritual interview." My heart started racing. I knew what it meant. I would have to sit alone in front of an older man and expose my soul. When I entered the room, the bishop was sitting behind a large wooden desk. He was a man with a firm voice and a stern look. He told me to close the door and sit in the chair in front of him. "Daughter, do you know why you're here?" he asked, in a paternalistic tone that brought me no comfort at all. He nodded. He knew. We all did. We're here to cleanse our hearts and make sure we're on the right path to the kingdom of heaven. Do you have anything to tell me? Any sin you wish to confess? That question always scared me. What exactly was he waiting to hear? Should I make something up? Or confess something I wasn't even sure was a sin? I stayed silent for a moment, but he stared at me, as if expecting something specific. "Have you had impure thoughts?" Froze. My face turned red, my throat went dry. He watched me with expectation. "Have you ever had inappropriate desires? Dreamed of something that wasn't pure?" I didn't know what to say. I had never done anything wrong, but how could I prove that? "Have you ever felt something strange when looking at a boy? Has anyone ever stirred your feelings in the wrong way?" I didn't want to be there. I wanted to disappear. He continued, "Daughter, don't hide anything. God sees everything, and He gave me the authority to help you. If you hide your sins, you're deceiving the Lord." The pressure was unbearable. So like all the girls did, I gave in. Sometimes. Get confused. I didn't really know what I was confessing, but I knew I had to say something. I knew that if I stayed silent, he would keep insisting, and the longer I waited, the more suspicious I would seem. "What confuses you, daughter? Tell me." I closed my eyes and tried to say anything that would satisfy him and end it quickly. Sometimes I think about things I shouldn't, that seemed vague enough. But I was wrong. "What kind of things? Be specific." My stomach turned. I didn't want to continue that conversation. "Have you touched yourself inappropriately?" My breath caught. What was he asking? How could I answer something like that? "This is important, daughter. I need to know if your purity is intact. If any man has tried anything with you. If you've made a mistake that needs to be corrected." My mind screamed, "This isn't right." But the guilt, the fear, and the submission were stronger. I just shook my head, denying everything. He watched me for a long time, as if trying to figure out whether I was telling the truth. Finally, he asked a few more questions about my spiritual life, my commitment to the church, and then sent me away with a stern warning. "If you ever feel anything impure in your heart, come back here immediately. Never hide anything, because a hidden sin becomes a burden before God." When I left that room, my legs were shaking. I wanted to cry, I wanted to run, I wanted to hide. But above all, I felt ashamed. Ashamed simply for being a woman. After that day, I understood why so many women whispered about those confessions. It wasn't a moment of purification. It was a moment of exposure, humiliation, and emotional abuse. I started hearing stories from other girls and realized that many had gone through even worse situations. Some were pressured into confessing things they had never done. Others were confronted with absurdly invasive questions that made them feel dirty, impure, sinful, simply for being human. One girl, named Elisa, once told me that she was called to confess because a boy from the church had shown interest in her. The boy wasn't questioned, but she was. The bishop asked me if I had given him any opening, if I had smiled at him in an inappropriate way. He made me feel like it was my fault he was interested in me. Another girl, Carolina, confided, "I was questioned about details of my body, about things no one had the right to ask. Felt dirty." These confessions weren't meant to free anyone. They were meant to oppress us, to shame us, to remind us that we were sinners and weak, always on the edge of condemnation. Women in the church were taught to carry guilt simply for existing. The worst part was that no one spoke openly about it. If a woman complained, she was accused of being rebellious. "You need to submit to spiritual authority, daughter. Do not question the servants of God." And so, the trauma was swallowed in silence. Many women left those confessions with invisible wounds, marks no one could see, but that hurt every single day. Some began to hate themselves, to see themselves as impure for having had normal thoughts. Others carried that guilt forever, believing they would never be worthy of God. And the cycle continued. New girls were called in. New invasive questions were asked. New traumas were planted. All in the name of a faith that made us feel less human and more condemned. Inside the church, there was no room for questioning. The prophet and the leaders were treated as divine, untouchable, superior beings. They spoke in God's name, and for that reason, their words were unquestionable. Since I was a child, I was taught that the leaders were chosen by the Lord Himself, that they had a special connection with the divine, that they received direct revelations from heaven. We, as simple believers, were only supposed to listen, obey, and accept everything without question. If a leader made a mistake or did something unjust, the blame was never on him. The blame was on the victim, on the person who dared to feel wronged, because doubting a leader was the same as doubting God. This was repeated countless times. God chose our leaders, and He does not make mistakes. If one of them acted in a certain way, we must trust that it was the will of the Lord. And so, spiritual blindness settled in. The church leaders had absolute power over our lives. They were the ones who decided who could hold certain positions, who could sing in the choir, who was worthy enough to participate in the more restricted meetings. They had the authority to determine whether a marriage was approved or not, whether someone could be baptized or not, even whether a person was spiritually strong enough to lead a public prayer. But there was something even more frightening. They also had the power to destroy someone's life. If a leader became upset with a member, all it took was a single sermon to turn the entire church against that person. I saw brothers and sisters who suddenly were treated as strayed, rebellious, unworthy, simply because they displeased a leader. If someone refused to follow an unjust order, if they dared to challenge something, they were publicly exposed and condemned before the congregation. The justification. Whoever does not submit to spiritual authority is rebelling against God. And no one dared to question that logic. Women were the most affected by this oppressive hierarchy. I saw many being humiliated and silenced, their voices erased by a system that accepted no criticism, only blind obedience. If a woman dared to raise her voice to challenge something, she was immediately labeled rebellious woman. She lacks humility. She's being led by pride. How many times did I see sisters crying in silence, unable to express any outrage, because they knew that if they spoke up, they would be punished? One of them, Clara, was a clear example of this. She was an intelligent, strong woman with genuine faith. But one day, she made the mistake of disagreeing with a leader in a closed meeting. Brother, with all due respect, I believe this decision might harm some of the sisters. Maybe we should reconsider. The leader, a man respected and feared in the church, stayed silent for a few moments. His expression turned cold. The following Sunday, without mentioning names, he stood at the pulpit and said, "Satan has been using some women to sow discord in the house of God. The spirit of rebellion is among us, and we must cut it at the root." Everyone knew who those words were directed at. Clara never opened her mouth again in church. And that was the fate of every woman who dared to think for herself. The leaders of the church had absolute power, and that made them untouchable. If one of them did something wrong, it was never their fault. There was a case of a bishop who was caught in a scandal. He was cheating on his wife with a sister from the church. The news spread quickly among the members, but instead of being held accountable, the blame was placed on the woman. She seduced him. She was used by the enemy to try to bring down a servant of God. If she were a true woman of God, this would never have happened. The woman was expelled from the church, publicly humiliated and shunned by everyone. The bishop, he remained in his position, untouched, as if nothing had happened. And that was just one of many cases. There were stories of young women who were coerced by leaders, of women who suffered psychological and spiritual abuse, of sisters who were manipulated into submitting to degrading situations in the name of faith. But none of it was ever spoken of openly, because questioning a leader was the greatest sin anyone could commit. The most frightening part was how the faithful defended these leaders with blind devotion. Even when a leader acted wrongly, the congregation found ways to justify it. He is a man of God, and men of God are tested too. If he made a mistake, it was because the enemy tried to bring him down, but God will strengthen him. We need to pray for him, not judge him. And so, the cycle was never broken. It was as if the leaders were above good and evil, as if they had the right to make mistakes, while the faithful had only the duty to obey. No one realized this wasn't faith. It was idolatry. For a long time I accepted this logic without question. I accepted that the leaders could never be wrong. I accepted that doubting them was a lack of faith. I accepted that if something seemed unfair, the problem was with me, not with the system. But little by little, I began to see what was really happening. The leaders weren't divine. They were just men, flawed men, men who took advantage of power, men who built a structure where they were untouchable and where the faithful were kept in ignorance through fear. And that's when I realized the hardest truth of all. God never wanted us to follow men blindly. The true gospel does not teach blind obedience. It does not teach silence in the face of injustice. It does not teach that we must accept everything without question. But within that church, that truth was a dangerous secret. And anyone who tried to reveal it became an enemy. In the church, the greatest sin one could commit wasn't making a mistake or even doubting. The worst crime someone could commit was leaving. Few had the courage to leave the congregation. Most stayed, even without faith, even without desire, because they knew what happened to those who walked away. People who gave up their faith were seen as traitors. More than that, they were treated as threats. Since childhood, I heard frightening stories about the strayed. Those who left the church lost everything. They were disowned by their families, abandoned by their husbands, shunned by friends. Outside the church, there is no protection. Whoever leaves is in the hands of the enemy. That phrase was repeated so many times it became a spiritual death sentence. The women who tried to escape suffered the worst repercussions. The first time I saw a woman erased from the church's history was with Martha. Martha was married to one of the deacons and had 2 small daughters. She was always a dedicated, faithful woman who followed every teaching to the letter. But one day she vanished. The news spread quickly, whispered from one person to another. Marta left the church. No one knew exactly what happened. Some said she couldn't take the marriage anymore. Others claimed she began questioning the teachings and the leaders decided to expel her. What really happened? We never found out. Her husband, who had always been seen as a loving and devoted man, showed no sadness or surprise. At the first service after Marta's disappearance, he stood at the pulpit and said, "Unfortunately, my wife was overtaken by the spirit of rebellion. We tried to bring her back, but her heart hardened. She made her choice, and now there's nothing more we can do." And then no one spoke of Marta again. People erased her from memory, as if she had never existed. It was like mourning without a funeral, an absence that wasn't to be mentioned. Her parents, who were also part of the church, said they no longer considered her their daughter. Her friends never spoke her name again. Her daughters were taught to say they didn't have a mother. And just like that, Marta disappeared. It wasn't just Marta. There were many others. Women who decided to leave because they could no longer bear the oppression, the abuse, the suffocating rules. Some were disowned by their families. Others were abandoned by their own husbands, who chose to follow the church rather than save their marriage. One of them, Lucia, was a strong woman with an independent spirit. When she decided to leave, her husband immediately asked for a divorce. The church pastor went to her house and demanded that she leave her children behind. A woman who abandons the faith cannot raise her children within the will of God. Lucia cried, begged, tried to fight. But no one stood by her. Not her parents, not her siblings, not her childhood friends. She lost everything. She lost her family, lost her children, lost the life she had built. And the church celebrated it as a spiritual victory. A burden has been lifted from our midst. May God have mercy on her soul. Some women were even threatened by members of the church. There were reports of former members who started speaking out against the leaders, who exposed the abuse, who tried to warn others. And those people disappeared. Not physically but spiritually. God handed them over to the enemy. That's how they explained their disappearance. There was a young woman named Beatrice, who started sharing videos online about what was happening inside the church. She spoke about the manipulation, the emotional abuse, the worship of the leaders. In less than a month, the video disappeared. And so did Beatrice. She was swallowed by the world. No one knew where she had gone. No news, no explanation. Her parents said she was dead to them. The pastors said that God had allowed the enemy to take her. And just like that, her story was erased. But what scared me the most was the secret that no one dared to say out loud. Some women disappeared physically. They vanished without a trace. And no one talked about it. It was as if they had never existed. There was a sister named Esther, who had always been very active in the church. One day, she began to show discontent. She said she wanted to leave. A few weeks later, she disappeared. People in the church said she had run away to live in sin. But no one ever saw her again. No one knew where she was. No one dared to ask. And so, her name was forgotten. That's why so many women remained trapped in the church, even when they no longer believed. The fear of losing everything. The fear of being abandoned. The fear of disappearing. If we left, there would be nothing left. And that was the greatest punishment of all. In the church, women were taught to stay silent. They could not question, could not oppose the imposed rules, could not complain about their suffering. But in secret gatherings, when the leaders' eyes weren't on us, the truths would come out. It was in one of those meetings that I discovered what was really happening to many women within the congregation. It was a clandestine gathering, held at the house of one of the older sisters in the church. There, the women could speak without fear, away from the watchful eyes of their husbands, away from the pulpit where they were silenced. And that night, I heard confessions that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The first woman to speak was Dona Teresa, a lady who had spent more than 30 years married to a violent man. Her face no longer showed physical marks, but her eyes carried a pain that never faded. When I got married, I thought God had given me a good husband. In the beginning, he was affectionate. But after the first year, everything changed. She took a deep breath before continuing. If I made a mistake, he would hit me. If he had a bad day, he took it out on me. I tried to talk, tried to ask for help. But every time I spoke to the church leaders, they told me the same thing. Divorce is a sin. God hates divorce. You need to pray more and be a submissive wife. The room fell silent. All of us had heard that same answer at some point. I endured it for years. Because they made me believe it was my responsibility to keep the marriage together. That God expected it from me. She sighed, her eyes filled with tears. When he died, I felt guilty for feeling relieved. But deep down, I knew that if it had been up to the church, I would have died beside him. No one said a word because we knew she was right. The second story came from a woman named Estella. She was younger, but her expression looked like someone who had aged far before her time. I was taught that marriage is forever, that we must obey our husbands as we obey God. So when my husband said he wanted to marry another woman, I went to the leaders to ask what I should do. She laughed, but it was a hollow laugh with no joy. You know what they told me? They said that if that was his wish, I should accept it. That the Bible has men with multiple wives, and that I shouldn't be selfish. She looked at all of us, as if searching for something she didn't even know how to name. I accepted it. But inside I died a little every day. Hearing her story, I realized that women's suffering was always minimized. If a man made a mistake, the woman had to endure it. If a man wanted someone else, the woman had to accept it. If a man sinned, the woman had to pray for him. It was never about what we wanted, never about what we felt. But what horrified me the most were the stories of arranged marriages. That was when Carolina, a girl with downcast eyes and a trembling voice, finally gathered the courage to speak. When I was 15, my father told me I was going to get married. He didn't ask what I thought, he gave me no choice. The man was over 40. I cried, I begged, but my father said it was God's will. She lowered her head even more, as if still ashamed of what had happened. The pastor came to my house to convince me. He said I should feel blessed to receive a husband chosen by the Lord. That my mission in life was to be a good wife and give children to a man of faith. She swallowed hard, and everyone in the room held their breath. So they married me to him. I was just a girl. Her eyes shimmered with tears she refused to let fall. And I only realized too late that I had been sold. There was a long silence. None of us could say a word, because what Carolina lived through wasn't an isolated case. It happened all the time. But the most terrible confession came from a woman everyone called Sister Marissa. She was older, but her presence was strong, firm. When she started to speak, her voice carried a different kind of pain. I saw many things inside the church, things that could never be spoken out loud. She looked at each of us, as if wanting to make sure we were ready to hear. Years ago, I discovered cases of sexual abuse committed by leaders of the congregation. The shock was immediate. We all froze. It was veiled, hidden. But the rumors spread. Very young girls who were called in for private talks with older leaders. Women who, suddenly, were expelled from the church with no explanation. She paused, and her breathing grew heavier. When I tried to speak about it with the pastors, I was silenced. They said I was seeing things that weren't there. They said God would take care of everything. That it was better to keep quiet to avoid causing scandals. The outrage burned inside me. There was no justice in that church. Only silence, fear, and secrets. And hers wasn't the only story. Another woman, Julia, said she knew of a young girl who got pregnant by a church leader and was expelled. She was accused of being a temptation, of seducing the pastor. He remained in his position. She was disowned and disappeared. My stomach churned. How was this allowed? How could no one do anything? But the truth was that no one could do anything. Anyone who tried to expose the abuse was destroyed. That meeting changed everything for me. Until then, I knew there was something wrong with the church, but I had no idea of the depth of the secrets being hidden. Women forced to remain in violent marriages. Wives pressured to share their husbands with other women. Girls handed over in arranged marriages like merchandise. Abuse swept under the rug to protect the reputation of the leaders. All covered up by silence and fear. And the worst part, if anyone tried to speak up, they disappeared. I never imagined that leaving the church would be an act of war. I grew up believing that was the only path, that my life only had value if it was lived within that community, surrounded by rules, under the watchful eyes of the leaders. But little by little, the truth began to reveal itself to me. The lies, the abuse, the oppression. I saw women being silenced. I saw wives forced to accept humiliation. I saw girls given away as brides with no choice. I saw untouchable leaders committing crimes in the name of faith. I saw the truth. And once I saw it, I couldn't pretend I didn't know anymore. But leaving wasn't as simple as it seemed. The church didn't let anyone go without consequences. That's why it took me so long to make the decision. I knew what happened to those who dared to leave. I knew about the threats, the exile, the way they were erased from the memory of those who stayed. And even so, when I finally gathered the courage to leave, I realized the cruel price of seeking the truth. The idea of leaving the church began to take shape after I discovered everything that happened in the shadows. The forced marriages, the silenced abuse, the women who mysteriously disappeared. I couldn't stay there any longer. But at the same time, I didn't know how to escape. I was afraid. Afraid of being rejected, afraid of being followed, afraid of ending up alone. After all, everything I knew was inside those invisible walls. Outside the church, what would be left for me? Even so, I knew staying would be worse. I couldn't bear living suffocated any longer, chained to a faith that brought not freedom, but captivity. The first step was to stop attending services. First, I tried to be discreet. I didn't want to draw attention, so I said I was sick, that I needed to study, that my family needed me at home. But soon the questions started. Why aren't you coming to the meetings? Is everything okay with your faith? What's going on with you? They were questions that, on the surface, seemed caring. But in reality, they were warnings. They noticed my change and it bothered them. So I started lying. I said I needed some time, that I was searching for answers, that I still believed, just in a different way. But no one accepted that. Inside the church, you're either completely in or you're against them. There's no middle ground. When they realized I was truly pulling away, the threats began. One night, I received a phone call from one of the church leaders. His voice was calm, but it carried something dark. "Daughter, we know you've been questioning some things. We know you have doubts. But God has already revealed to us what's happening with you." My heart started racing. What did God reveal? I asked, trying not to show fear. The leader sighed, as if he felt sorry for me. "That you are being influenced by evil forces. That your heart has become hardened." I swallowed hard. "That's not true." But he interrupted me. Do you think you can walk away and be at peace? Do you think you can question the work of God without consequences? Do you know what happens to those who stray? Silence. They lose everything. I hung up the phone with trembling hands. I knew that was a warning. And little by little, hell began. The following Sunday, my family called me in for a conversation. My father, my mother, and my siblings sat around the table, serious, as if they were standing before a court. We had a visit from the church leaders. They said, "You're drifting away." My father stared at me with a stern expression. "Is it true?" I knew that moment would come. I tried to prepare myself, but nothing could have truly prepared me for it. I took a deep breath. Yes, it's true. I don't want to be a part of this anymore. The silence that followed was worse than any scream. My mother started crying. My father clenched his fists. My brother shook his head, as if I had committed the worst sin. Then came the sentence. "If you leave, you will no longer be part of this family." My heart stopped. What? You heard me. We don't want contact with the strayed. We don't want a rebellious spirit in this house. My eyes burned, but I held back the tears. I'm your daughter. You were. That night was the worst of my life. I was rejected. I was cast out of my own home, from my own family. And they weren't the only ones. My friends stopped reaching out. People I grew up with acted like I didn't exist. At church, they started spreading lies about me. They said I was possessed, that I had been corrupted by the world, that Satan had poisoned me. And worst of all, some people began following me. I was being watched. I would leave for work and feel eyes on me. When I walked near the church, some people would whisper and look away. Once, a man from the congregation saw me on the street and said quietly, "There's still time to come back. But if you keep going down this path, your life will be hell." I knew he wasn't speaking metaphorically. I received anonymous messages. Some told me I needed to ask for forgiveness. Others were just veiled threats. Watch what you say. God punishes the rebellious. You have no protection anymore. And for the first time, I realized how much that church controlled people's lives. I saw women who wanted to leave but couldn't. They had nowhere to go. No support. Nothing but fear. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. How many women were trapped there, not by faith, but by desperation? How many stayed because they knew that if they left, they would lose everything? And in that moment I made a decision. I wouldn't just leave. I would fight to expose the truth, even if it cost me my life. When I finally left the church, I felt an overwhelming emptiness take over me. For years, I had been taught to believe that outside of that place, my life would have no purpose, that everything would fall apart, that without the church I would never find peace, love, or safety. I grew up hearing that those who walked away from God ended up alone, unhappy, lost, handed over to despair. And for a long time I believed that narrative because it had been implanted in my mind as an absolute truth, an unquestionable dogma. But the truth is that when I left, I found myself plunged into fear, uncertainty, and guilt. I looked around and felt like I was walking aimlessly, like I was lost in a never-ending desert. The silence was deafening, the loneliness was crushing, and no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that I had done the right thing, doubt was eating me alive. Had I really made a mistake? Had I condemned myself to suffering? Was everything they taught me true, and was I now doomed to fail? In the first few months I tried to find another church, a place where I could feel safe, where maybe I could keep believing without the weight of judgment, without manipulation, without the fear that had controlled me for so many years. But with every service I attended, every sermon I heard, every religious leader who stepped up to the pulpit to preach, everything felt exactly the same as what I had left behind. The same rules, the same speeches about blind obedience, The same power structures that placed some people as holders of the truth and others as mere followers incapable of thinking for themselves. The same suffocating doctrines that dictated how I should behave, how I should dress, how I should speak, and even how I should think. I realized that even in different places, the pattern repeated itself, and I could no longer accept it as something normal. For the first time, I began to wonder if the problem wasn't just that specific church I had left, but rather an entire system built on control, on fear, on the idea that God is a distant and punitive being who demands our unquestioning submission. That's when I decided to stop. I decided that instead of looking for another place to fit in, I would seek God for myself. I picked up my Bible, the one that had always been in my house but that I had only ever read through the interpretation imposed by religious leaders. This time, I opened its pages and began to read without the influence of the doctrines I had been taught, without the pastor's voices echoing in my mind, without the obligation to understand everything according to the vision that had been forced on me. And then, I began to see Jesus in a completely different way than what I had been taught. I discovered a Jesus who welcomed the rejected, who sat at the table with sinners, who spoke to women when no one else would, who didn't condemn but extended his hand, who never used fear as a tool of control, who never forced anyone to follow him, who never imposed inhumane rules or unbearable burdens. I discovered a Jesus who challenged the religious authorities of his time, who confronted those who used faith to exploit others, who rebuked those who placed rules above love, who taught that the kingdom of God was not a place of abusive hierarchies, but a place of grace and freedom. And then, a truth that had always been right in front of me became impossible to ignore. The church I left had never taught me the true gospel. Throughout my life, I was taught to obey rules, to fear God as someone who could punish me for the slightest mistake, to believe that my salvation depended on my total submission to a religious structure. But now, reading the scriptures without the filter of manipulation, I realized that everything I had been taught had been distorted to maintain control over me. I discovered that Jesus never oppressed women, never ordered them to be silent, never said that faith meant blindly obeying men who presented themselves as the exclusive representatives of God. I discovered that the true gospel is not a system of rules that limits and imprisons, but a path of love, of transformation, and of freedom. And that's how, little by little, the fear that had tormented me my whole life began to disappear. For the first time I began to experience real faith, a faith without guilt, without absurd impositions, without the feeling that I would never be good enough. For the first time I didn't feel like I had to prove myself to God, that I had to follow a rigid set of rules to be accepted, that I had to fulfill requirements to be worthy of love. I understood that God had always been with me, that he had never abandoned me, that he wasn't waiting for me inside a church full of suffocating dogmas, but rather inside my own heart, where he had always dwelled. For the first time, I understood that my worth wasn't tied to what the leaders said about me, nor to what the church defined as right or wrong. My worth lay in the simple fact that I was created by a God who loves me unconditionally, a God who never wanted me bound by religious chains, but who always wanted to set me free. And then, a thought that once seemed terrifying became an unshakable truth. I never needed the church to be close to God. I never needed leaders to tell me what was right or wrong. I never needed doctrines that placed me as inferior, as an incurable sinner, as someone who would only be accepted if I obeyed without question. True faith is not about control. True faith is not about fear. True faith is not about silence. True faith is about love, about grace, about walking with God without chains, without eternal guilt, without the feeling that I'm always in debt. Took me time to understand that. It took time to heal the wounds, to reprogram my mind, to completely free myself from the fear I had been taught to carry. There were still moments of doubt, moments of uncertainty, scars that throbbed when I remembered everything I had lived. But now I knew that God was with me. Not because I followed strict rules, not because I obeyed blindly, not because I feared punishment. God was with me because He always had been. Because He never needed me to fit into a religious system to love me. Because He never wanted me to be a slave to man-made traditions. Now I was free. And that freedom, the true freedom that comes from God, was everything I had ever needed. Today, I share my story because I know there are still many women trapped within this oppressive structure, living under the weight of doctrines that were not created to set them free, but to control them, following rules that do not come from God, but from men who proclaim themselves His representatives. I know there are women who, just like I once did, feel suffocated within a faith built on fear, on forced submission, on constant guilt, and who carry in their hearts the same silent question that once consumed me. Does God really want us to live this way? I know speaking out about this is dangerous. I know I may be attacked, discredited, slandered, and even threatened because I'm touching on truths that many would rather ignore, because I'm revealing what has been hidden for years inside these churches that call themselves sacred but hide abuse and injustice under the cloak of faith. I know my voice bothers those who profit from others' submission, who build their kingdoms on fear and blind obedience, who use the name of God to impose rules He never asked for, to place themselves in positions of power He never ordained. But the truth must be told, because there are many women still living under the belief that they have no choice, that they have no right to question, that they cannot dream of a life where faith is not a prison. For a long time I was made to believe that questioning the church was the same as questioning God, that doubting the leaders meant doubting the Creator Himself, that leaving the structure that oppressed me meant abandoning my salvation. But I discovered that God never wanted me bound, that He never placed chains on me, that He never asked me to stay silent in the face of injustice. I discovered that Jesus, the true Jesus, was always with the outcasts, with the silenced women, with those condemned by the religious authorities of His time. And then I realized that my mission was not to keep accepting a system that diminished me, but to warn other women that there is a different path. There is a faith that doesn't oppress. There is a God who does not demand that they become slaves to man-made dogmas. If you are reading this and feel like something is wrong, if you feel like your faith is based on fear and not love, if you realize that you're being manipulated into following rules that suffocate you, that make you feel less than, that make you believe you'll never be good enough, that you must blindly obey to be accepted, know that this is not the faith God wants for you. God truly loves you, not because of what you do or don't do, but because of who you are. He created you with purpose, with freedom, with dignity. And He never intended for you to live under the yoke of people who use faith to control, oppress, and silence. The truth sets us free. And the greatest truth I've discovered is that I don't have to be afraid anymore. I no longer need to walk the tightrope of religiosity. I no longer need to carry the guilt I was taught to feel. I no longer need to bow before leaders who claim to be God's spokesman but act as owners of others' faith. Today, I am free because I understand that my relationship with God doesn't depend on any human structure, that He loves me without impossible demands, without absurd impositions, without eternal guilt. And now I choose to live with Christ, not under the rules of men. I choose to walk in freedom, knowing that God is with me not because I follow religious traditions, but because He always has been. I choose not to bow anymore to human authorities who place themselves above the truth, but instead to follow the one who never oppressed, never silenced, never placed burdens that couldn't be carried. I choose not to accept that faith be used as a tool for domination, but as a path of love, of healing, and of true transformation. The voice they once told me to silence, today I raise. The truth they once tried to hide from me, today I proclaim. The fear that once controlled me, today has no power over me. If you feel like you need to leave but are afraid of losing everything, know that there is life beyond those chains. There is a God who does not condemn you, who does not demand perfection from you, who does not ask you to erase yourself to be accepted. You are free. You always have been. And God has always wanted you to know that.